So we have been talking about the brain, and in particular, we've been talking about the cerebrum, and in particular, we've been talking about the cerebral cortex. And we haven't quite finished, so we're going to continue with the cerebral cortex. Let me get a smaller. And again, what do we mean by the cerebral cortex?
Gray matter.
Yeah.
And what particular?
And deep nuclei.
Say it again.
And deep nuclei. They are cell bodies.
So the cortex, the word cortex, what does cortex mean?
The outer.
It's the outer layer. So it's the layer that is all on the outside of this. And again, we're going to be looking at the deeper nuclei in a little bit later today. The the caudate nucleus, the lentiform nucleus, things like that. But right now we're just talking about the gray matter that's right on the surface, that if you pop somebody's brain out of their head, you'd be touching the cortex. It's the surface, it's the gray matter on the surface. Again, what was the functionality here in like the post-central gyrus?
Somatosensory cortex.
That was the primary somatosensory cortex, kind of the general senses. What about here in the occipital area?
The primary visual cortex.
Primary visual. We had primary auditory here in the temporal lobe. What do we have up here in the precentral gyrus?
Primary motor cortex.
Primary motor. Part of the way I remember when I was, even now, I still use this little, it's not cheating to have mnemonics or having little tricks to remember things. It's like, that's how we remember things. So the way I've always remembered that the motor cortex is the one that's more in front, the precentral is that M comes before S in the alphabet. So S is later in the alphabet, S is further back. It's in the post-central gyrus, back here in the parietal lobe. So if you're trying to remember like is it pre or post? Like the motor is the one that comes before, it's in front because M comes before S. So if that's helpful. So we've been talking about all of these. The other major area that we should mention formally is up here. This is my prefrontal area, prefrontal cortex. So all of this is frontal. This motor and motor association areas is frontal, but prefrontal is like really the front of the frontal. Sometimes it's like orbitofrontal because it's kind of up above the orbits, like where your eyes are. And the prefrontal areas are doing the kind of fancy, hold on. So kind of executive functions. So when we talk about executive functions, like you think about the executive of a company as the one who decides the big picture of how do we allocate our resources? What direction are we taking this company? What's the future? So this is where you're making decisions. This is impulse control. That's part of decisions too. Like I think I mentioned, like in one of my classes, we had a patient with prefrontal damage. He had like head planted off of some horrible motorcycle accident. And, you know, he was kind of animated and interesting. And he also talked about, or, you know, the people who worked with him talked about how he was very inappropriate. Again, he'd see like a woman he found attractive and just reach out and try to grab and touch her. You know, executive functions, decisions, impulse control. This is also, you know, kind of where your personality is. You know, a classic example of like most people have read about in like psychology classes is like, you know, Phineas Gage, the guy who got the steel rod through his head, right? If you have some stroke and you damage the motor cortex, you're going to be paralyzed for part of your body. There's going to be motion impairment. If you have a stroke that's damaging part of your visual cortex or something, you are going to have problems with your visual processing. If you have damage up here, it's not necessarily going to be an obvious deficit in the way like a sensory kind of thing or a motor thing, but you know, your personality can change dramatically. That supposedly this one guy became like kind of a jerk after being a really nice guy. So personality. So a lot of like kind of the more, these things up in here. Imagination. So prefrontal, you know, and so these are all kind of basic areas. And then there's a couple of special areas that we need to, and actually before we go to these special areas, let me talk about laterality. So, right, you have a left and a right hemisphere of your brain. So here's all this cortex on one side, cortex on the other side. These are your eyes kind of looking at you. For some reason that nobody knows, the two sides of the brain are connected to the opposite sides of the body. So left hemisphere, left hemisphere controls right side of the body. And the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. This is important to remember because if you have a stroke that damages part of your brain, let's say you have a stroke that damages your precentral gyrus on the right side of your brain, what kind of deficits are you going to find? What kind of problems?
Motor on the right side. It's precentral gyrus.
Yeah, so it'd be motor, but if it's on the right side,
Left.
it's going to be a problem. So paralysis on the left side of your body. Or if you have damage in your postcentral gyrus on the left, there's going to be sensory deficits, problems with sensation on the right side of your body. So when you're looking at what kind of deficits you're going to find from some kind of a stroke, you need to remember that everything's cross-wired. You know, there's literally the axons move from one side of the brain to the other side of the body. A lot of it happens just, you know, down the brain stem, and the rest of it happens going down in the spinal cord. But basically the neurons that connect to the brain, at some point the axons, they call it decussate. So decussation. Decussation just means crossing over. So the axons that connect to one side of your body at some point cross left to right or right to left to end up connected to the opposite side of the brain. Other things about laterality.
I'm sorry, Professor Eggert. So that neurons would decousinate to the other side of the brain. Is that how you would use that term?
Yeah, you could say decussate. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
There are also some differences in basic function. For most people, for about 90%, let's talk about language. 90% of people, it's on the left side. So this is another thing of laterality, where something is on one side versus the other. You know, maybe somewhere around 5% of people, it's on the right hemisphere. These, interestingly, tend to be lefties, people who have prefer to use their left hand dominant. You know, maybe 5% is kind of mixed. But for most people, language is on the left hemisphere, you know, for whatever reason. We'll talk more about that in a few moments. And there's a couple of particular areas that are identified with processing of language, different aspects of language that we'll look at. Other things that are kind of lateralized, you know, there's stuff in pop culture even about left brain and right brain, and there is, you know, that is coming from basic research. Like the left hemisphere in general tends to be kind of more analytical, you know, looking at, you know, for language, looking at the meaning of language versus kind of the emotional content, for instance, the affective aspects of language. The left hemisphere tends to be more dealing with meaning and language or numbers, whereas the right side is more kind of spatial relationships. You know, the left side would be more about using your hands to write versus the right hemisphere would be using your hands to kind of tactilely understand, what am I holding here? So there is kind of this kind of more logical side to the kind of processes you tend to find on the left hemisphere, and kind of that more kind of integrative, like what does this all mean kind of thing on the right side. Yeah, I mean, speaking of, yeah, like language though, like if you think about what is language? You know, there's the meaning of the words I'm saying, but that's only part of it. You know, if I am talking to you, like in one of the examples I often use, you know, I could, you know, so there's semantic content. Semantic meaning like, what do the words actually mean? You know, and, you know, it could be, you know, it's delightful to see the class here today. And it's like, hey, it's great to see you all here this morning. You know, or maybe I just got up on the wrong side of bed and I'm looking at the screen with everybody and it's like, I still don't want to be here. And I'm like, oh, great to see you all here this morning. You know, and it's like the words are exactly the same. The content of what I'm saying, or the semantic content, the meaning is identical, but what it really means is totally different depending on my intonation and my facial expression and the way what I'm, you know, great to see you or great to see you, you know, so the left side of the brain is kind of picking apart what do the words actually mean in terms of definitions. But then the right side is also working with kind of the affect, emotional, like what are like the nonverbal clues actually saying about what this actually means as well. So kind of putting that out there. There is kind of a division of right and left and different aspects of things that are being processed. So anyway, back to our brain. So we've kind of brought in all these different regions. Now I'm going to bring in two regions that are specifically concerned with, in fact, actually, before I do that, I've been using the word stroke, but I should actually probably define stroke more officially. So just in case people don't know exactly what I'm talking about. So let's do a little sidebar here. Stroke. If you're going to be more fancy, you'd say CVA, a cerebrovascular accident. So there is something gone wrong with the blood flow to the brain. So it can be temporary. You can get TIAs. This is like a temporary ischemic attack. This means the blood flow is being blocked and you're going to start having symptoms. You're going to like all of a sudden start, part of your body isn't working. But then temporary, so ischemia is when you have a lack of blood flow. Temporary meaning it only goes for a little bit and then the blood flow resumes and so you're okay again. It's like, whoa, it's like half my body was paralyzed, but now all of a sudden I'm okay again. TIA is also can be used in a heart attack, right? A heart attack is also a block of blood flow. If you have a temporary ischemic attack in your coronary arteries, that's what we call angina pectoris, like it's crushing pain in my chest, but then it resolves. You're okay again. You know, if the blood flow doesn't return to your heart, then you've got a heart attack and you're starting to like lose muscle and stuff. So CVA, let's stay in the brain. Obviously, depending on what parts of the brain are being deprived of blood and oxygen and what cells are dying, you're going to have different kinds of symptoms. So a lot of times, the areas that get affected, though, are these language areas. So when I'll talk about, strokes that affect Broca's area, Wernicke's, so there's been some lack of blood flow. And we'll talk about, when we get to the cardiovascular system, we'll talk about different things that can go wrong with like thrombosis and things like that. You can get things that get stuck in the vessels that block flow. You can also just get like atherosclerosis where there's just less and less flow because you've got plaques coming in and blocking flow in. You can have hemorrhagic strokes where there's actually a burst blood vessel. So now the blood is just spilling out, continuing on its way to where it's supposed to go. So there's lots of different ways you can have a cerebrovascular accident. It can be from a block. It can be from hemorrhaging, from a tear. But in general, it's a bad thing. Yeah, and people's usually have some initial symptomology. Usually there's a certain period of time where there's usually some recovery based on the brain's ability to kind of have plasticity and rewire. But after a while, there's often some lasting deficits, sometimes severe. While we're talking about problems that happen, we should also briefly talk about epilepsy while we're here. Epilepsy, usually I talk about this a little earlier even because, some of these original experiments where, people were mapping out the motor homunculus and the amount of sensory homunculus back in the 50s. Like, how come the people had their brain exposed and their skull off? A lot of times it was doing surgery trying to deal with epilepsy. Epilepsy, they're kind of like electrical storms in the brain. The basic idea here is you have some little region of neural tissue in your brain that is hyperexcitable and just starts going off for no reason. It shouldn't go off, but it does. But the problem is if that little, you have some little area, some little focus area, like if we have, here's the brain, let's put a brain in here. Here's the brain. There's some little area, and all of a sudden it starts getting excited, and then it starts, just because it's going up above threshold, the neighboring areas go up above threshold, and all of a sudden you have this like electrical storm happening there because this one little area started firing off when it shouldn't have, and but then excited the areas around it. If that electrical storm ends up covering the entire brain, you can get what's called a grand mal seizure. I just misspelled seizure there. Grand mal seizure is if that electrical storm covers everything, and that's, the classic thing, this person's just convulsing on the floor or whatever. But they don't have to be like that. You can have, in fact, there are these things called petit mal seizures. These are also called absence seizures. These are actually relatively common in kids. And there's no dramatic convulsing or anything. It's just the kid kind of checks out, basically. They're sitting there and you're like, hello, anybody home? But nobody's home. And then after a little while, they come back and they didn't even know they were gone. So a petit mal seizure is an electrical storm, but the way it manifests, the way it presents is just by the person just being kind of awake, but yet unconscious. These often resolve as kids get older and the brain gets into its kind of final wiring, they can just go away. You can also have epileptic seizures like in the auditory cortex that present as just hearing stuff like music and things are happening, or so there's different kinds of seizures. Obviously the grand mal are the most dramatic. And one of the dangers with this, aside from either like losing consciousness or convulsing, there's this idea of kindling, which I should mention. And the basic idea here is that every time you have a seizure, that it causes some damage to the area and to the surrounding areas. So the more seizures you have, the more likely you are to have subsequent seizures. and to have worse seizures. So if somebody has epilepsy of some sort or has some kind of seizure disorder, they really want to make sure they control it so you don't have this damage just spreading and getting worse. It can be controlled sometimes just by drugs, like those benzodiazepines that just makes your whole brain less excitable. Sometimes there's a number of anti-seizure medications that work by just kind of making things a little less excitable, making it less likely that you're going to have one of these electrical storms. If you have some epileptic focus that is just really not controllable through drugs, then they go in and they literally will ablate. It's better to just remove whatever little piece of the brain is causing those problems than to just let the seizure disorder spread and get worse. And it can be more than just the physical things that I'm talking about. It was actually really sad. A couple of years ago, I had a student who eventually dropped physiology, who part of their disorder was it really messed with their memory. They could study so hard and work so hard, and their ability to just hold on to information would just be tenuous, and then things would evaporate. So, if you just kind of hung out with them and they were really nice, but it was really tragic because this person desperately wanted to be a nurse and was probably never going to get there because this condition made it impossible for them to kind of really hold on to long-term memories in the way that was necessary. So that's again, other reasons why you really want to work with this. I remember actually another patient, like during my classes that we met, who talked about how she would look at pictures of her and her friends from a few years ago, and her friends would like, oh my God, that was so much fun. And she look at them and it's like, I don't have no memory of being here with you guys, but I'm sure it was. So it can lead to that kind of stuff as well. But anyway, if you're wondering, like, why do people cut people's heads open and go in and destroy part of their brain? It's because you want to stop this kind of kindling stuff. All right, let's get back here. So, two areas of the brain particularly involved with language, and again, often affected by strokes. One of the main arteries that's coming in that can get blocked during a stroke is feeding one or both of these areas. So kind of down here, kind of down in the premotor area, you have this area called Broca's area. And this is about kind of language production. So this is where it's useful to really there's things we take for granted that our brain is doing that are actually insanely complicated and cool and kind of magical almost. Like in my head, I have some idea of what I want to say, and it just happens. Like, in fact, the word happens just happens. Like, it just spews out of my mouth. I'm talking to you, I can go, la, la, la. The quick red fox jumped over the lazy dogs. It's like whatever is in my head magically becomes this motor pattern of my tongue and my lips and my mouth moving in these crazy ways to make the words just appear and vibrate out into the air for you to listen to. That's this crazy, crazy processing and control. and kind of transforming this imaginary thing of words into some physical motion. So that's what this kind of Broca's area. You know, when there's damage to Broca's area, you can know what you want to say, but it doesn't come out. Any kind of problem with language production is called an aphasia. Aphasia is like problems with language production, or not production, problems with language, I should say. If you have problems with Broca's area, sometimes they call it Broca's aphasia. Whoops. They sometimes call it expressive aphasia. Because you can't express yourself, you know what you want to say, but you can't say it. Sometimes they say non-fluent aphasia, meaning you are not fluent, you can't make words easily. In a few moments, I'll show you, I actually created a little page in the Canvas thing that links to a couple of nice little examples from YouTube. I'll show them to you in a couple of moments of what it looks like if you have damages here. And the other area is kind of the parietal area, or kind of at this junction here, is called Wernicke's area. And both of these get their name after these neurologists back in the 1800s. There was Paul Broca, and I forgot what Wernicke's first name was, but they basically would have patients that were exhibiting these different aphasias. And then after these patients died, they could do an autopsy and find out what part of the brain had been damaged. So that was some of the initial understandings of these regions that are essential for language production, or for Wernicke's area, language understanding. So like when people have Wernicke's aphasia, they have trouble knowing what the words mean. Sometimes they call it receptive aphasia. Meaning you are, expressive aphasia means you're having trouble making the words, expressing the words, having them come out. Receptive aphasia means you're having trouble letting the words come in, understanding what they mean. This can also be called fluent aphasia. Fluent because the person has the ability to produce words, but the words don't mean anything, or the words aren't the words that they wanted to make come out. In fact, yeah, let me just do this. I can, let me go to the modules here. So I'm gonna share my screen here.
One question, doctor. Receptive aphasia, it's that the person cannot say the words that they are thinking?
No, it's more that they have trouble understanding what the words mean.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm going to share. So under this is in, my God, we're in remote week 8. Here I put aphasia examples as a little page for y'all. Like here's a couple of examples of Broca's or non-fluent aphasia.
Can you tell us your name?
Mike Caputo.
And Mike, when was your stroke?
I was 7 years ago.
Okay.
And
what did you used to do?
Worked Autodesk, seven sales and worldwide, and very good. Yeah.
Okay. And who are you looking at over there when you turn your head?
That's my wife.
Okay. And why is she helping you to talk?
She's a speech.
So you have trouble with your speech?
Yeah.
And what's that called?
Aphasia.
All right. And so why don't you work now?
I do.
And what do you do now?
For
All right, so just so you get a sense how tricky it is for him to get words out. This one's even more kind of tragic. This was like a girl who was pretty young. Where did it go?
Okay. So what's your name?
Scott. Oh, no. Sarah Scott.
That's right. And how old are you?
I can't.
Try.
I can't.
You're 19. 19. Yeah. And what happened to you?
Stroke.
You had a stroke last year.
Yes.
What happened? Can you remember what happened?
School and English class,
Okay.
and I book and I read it aloud, but I can't because stroke. And
All right, so you get a sense, like she as well. You know, and I've seen like videos of her later. She can get better as time has gone on. So that is Broca's aphasia, that expressive aphasia. You like both those people know what they want to say. They understand the question, but they just can't make the words come out. Again, like I said, there's
Is
this
she
magic
able?
thing. What's that?
I was just gonna say, is she able to write down exactly what she wants to say? Is that a different part of your brain?
A lot of strokes, so you can't write either. So it's like kind of just creating kind of the expressing. I think there's slightly different versions, but I don't think she can effectively write everything as either. Because there is this kind of translation going on into what the words would be.
I
But
actually had a patient one time that had something similar, and she did have a hard time even writing things down.
yeah, so that's, yeah, I think that's common. So the other one is weirder in some ways, because sometimes you don't even know if they even understand your question, or they just don't have the ability to know what their words meaning that are coming out of their mouth, but they have no problem at all making the words come out. So if you look at this guy, he has no trouble talking, but you know, often what they'll talk about word salad or something. One of the things I was reading, like one of the people talk about Broca being kind of like, you know, your language is broken, it's not working, but Wernicke's is more kind of wacky. You just say whatever. I was like, that's kind of true, especially if you look at some of this stuff. So this is like a guy with the fluent aphasia, Wernicke's.
Hi, Byron. How are you?
I'm happy. Are you pretty? You look good.
What are you doing today?
We stayed with the water over here at the moment and talk with the people for them over there. They're diving for them at the moment. They'll save in the moment. He'll have water very soon for him, with luck for him.
So we're on a cruise and we're about to
We
get to
will
Juneau.
store it right here and they'll save their hands right there for them.
And what were we just doing with the iPad?
Right at the moment, they don't show a darn thing.
With the iPad that we were doing. Like here?
I'd like my change for me and change hands for me. With happy. I would talk with Donna sometimes. We're out with them. Other people are working with them. I'm very happy with them.
Good.
This girl was really good and happy when I play golf and hit other trees. We play out with the hands. We'd save a lot of hands on hold for people, for us, other hands. I don't know what you get, but I talk with a lot of hand for him. Sometime. Am I talk of any more to say?
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
All right, so you get the sense that he has no trouble talking. He talks like on and on, but he doesn't make much sense. If you're interested in this stuff, there's a lot of videos online where you can see, like, there's some kind of heartbreaking ones also, just like these couples where they're going through these therapies where they're trying to talk to each other. Like, one person is really trying to understand what the other person's saying, and they're 15 minutes of kind of just random words swirling around and thinking maybe we kind of understand what each other are talking about. So and sometimes it can be tricky knowing what's going on, whether or not, because some of the strokes can affect both. And then it's like, do they not know what the words mean? Is that why the words aren't coming out right? Or they know what they want to say, but they just can't make the words happen? So it can be tricky to diagnose exactly what's going on with these even. So obviously it's also really important, if you are going to do brain surgery, that you know which side of the brain your language is on. So, like, for instance, if you are going to go through brain surgery and they're going to be going near areas that are near language centers, like, you would not want to, like, if you were trying to get rid of a little part of the motor cortex in order to keep epilepsy from getting worse, if there was some little motor deficit, that's a small price to pay. But if you lose your ability to speak, that would be like completely tragic. So what they'll do is they actually have this, again, my friend has watched some of these happen. They'll put an anesthetic up one carotid artery versus the other carotid artery to anesthetize one hemisphere or the other hemisphere, and just have the person awake talking. And when you turn off one hemisphere, you can just see the person go mute. So then you can know, kind of in this non-invasive way, which side of the brain is their language on. So you can know for sure that we're not going to accidentally damage their language centers there. So I should probably, I put on my animated background, but I realize it's probably distracting here. Let me put on something.
It is very Matrix.
It is very Matrix. Let's go. There's enough stuff in the world that kind of are keeping us off balance. Let's like breathe. Be a beautiful stream. All right. Share content. Back to the whiteboard. So the language centers, definitely it's important to understand that there are specific language areas, and if they're damaged, the consequences can be pretty tragic there. All right, now we've been talking about all these areas kind of more on the cortex. There's a little more we'll be talking about it, but what I'm going to do now is talk about some of the deeper gray matter. So the deeper gray matter of the cerebrum. So this is not cortex anymore. And it actually probably would make sense to just show you a picture. Yeah, right here. I'm going to share. So here you can see the brain, and the brain is, whoopsie daisy. Here you can see the cortex that we've been talking about, but then this area, which is kind of pink here, that is these deeper pockets of gray matter, these nuclei. There's the caudate nuclei. Again, you don't need to know the anatomy of it. It's called caudate because it kind of looks like it has a big tail. Caudate means from tail. There's the lentiform nuclei. The lentiform nuclei get their name because they're kind of more lens-shaped. This is a term here that is used a lot, basal ganglia, but it's not the proper term. Please don't try not to propagate that. You should know the word basal ganglia because that's used a lot to describe these deeper pockets of gray matter. But in reality, ganglia should only be referring to neurons outside of the CNS, out in the peripheral nervous system. So kind of bad terminology for our current use of the word. But it's been used for a long time. So just giving you a sense, what we're talking about now is this gray matter down deeper in there. Sometimes they call it the basal nuclei. And again, ganglia, you should know because they often do refer to them as basal ganglia, but again, don't get confused that this word shouldn't be used in the brain. There's the caudate nucleus. There's the lentiform nucleus. Again, there's if this is the brain that we've been talking about here, I can use so there's the brain, and now what we're doing is we're looking down deep. You have to dig, and then you find the caudate and the lentiform. There's going to be another little one down here at the tip of the caudate here, called the amygdala, which is important. We'll talk about amygdala or amygdaloid nucleus. Amygdaloid means like almond shaped. It's kind of almond shaped. And the lentiform is also made up of subparts like the putamen and the globus pallidus. For our class, you don't need to know all that. Let's talk a bit about what some of these are doing. So like the caudate and the lentiform, these are important for motor control, but they're more for modulation of motor control. Right, so some of the thinking is, you have one body, but you've got all these different processes working in parallel, trying to figure out what exactly do I do. So these are kind of like gating the access to your muscles to make sure that there's kind of one thing that your body is all doing. When you have damage or when you have problems with these areas, it's not paralysis. If you have damage to your prefrontal cortex, not prefrontal, precentral, sorry. If you have damage to your precentral gyrus, like the primary motor cortex, you're going to have paralysis. It's just part of your body isn't going to move. When you have problems with these regions, however, which happens in Parkinson's disease, we'll talk about, you have problems starting and stopping movements, or keeping things from moving and tremoring and things like that. So it's not about paralysis, it's about more of the kind of controlling of things though. So motor modulation here in these areas. Amygdala, on the other hand, this is going to be important for emotional processing. This is an area that is activated in fear and anxiety. It's one of the few parts of the brain that processes emotion where we have kind of an actual connection between particular emotions and particular neural activity. I'll talk more about the amygdala when we get to the limbic system. Other pockets of deeper gray matter that we'll talk about in a little while is the hippocampus. Hippocampus, this is like near the floor of the temporal lobe. There's gray matter down there, and the gray matter kind of curls. Hippocampus means seahorse. So somebody thought, oh my God, it looks just like a seahorse. The hippocampus is also going to be important in emotions and is also going to be, we'll see, critical in forming long-term memories. So hippocampus will be important pretty soon. Amygdala will be important. Caudate and lentiform are important for motor modulation. I should mention another term we have sometimes. So let me go, like if here's the cortex. So so we have gray matter, then there's the caudate, then there's the lentiform, and then there's all the white matter, which is zipping up through things. You've got, you know, the internal capsule. So you've got this thing where you have white, gray, white, gray, white. So sometimes the term for these, so sometimes it's called the basal nuclei, or again, improperly but commonly basal ganglia. Sometimes it's called the corpus striatum. It means striped body because you've got this, it looks kind of striped. It goes gray, white, gray, white, gray, white. If you just slice through there, you're saying, what's that area? Let's give it a name. Let's call it the striped body. So corpus striatum, or basal nuclei, or basal ganglia. And again, this is going to come up when we talk about Parkinson's a little later, because this is the area that gets dysregulated during Parkinson's and leads to kind of the motor problems in Parkinson's disease. Okie dokie. So let's continue. I think we're done with no, actually there's one more part of the cerebrum that I want to talk about before we get off of the cerebrum. So if I kind of look at the two halves of the brain, and I look at this little gyrus that is just kind of in the groove in between the two hemispheres, kind of right above the corpus callosum. What does the corpus callosum do?
Connects the right and left side of the hemispheres.
It connects the right and the left and the left and the right. So right above the corpus callosum, there's a little bit of cortex called the cingulate gyrus. That is going to come up. I think I've mentioned it before. It's going to come up when we do the limbic system as well. Part of what people have found there is that it seems to play a role in making the balance between emotional versus kind of pragmatic aspects of decision making. Like they've done these experiments where you give somebody a hypothetical situation and it's like 10 people die or one person dies. Let me write less. 10 people die or one person dies. And you have to make a decision that is going to lead to one or the other of these outcomes. And what people decide often depends not just on the pragmatic, let's just, put it on a scale and weigh, like, 10 people versus one person. Obviously, we want to try to minimize the amount of death, but it really depends on how it feels. Like if you have, the train is going off a track into a ravine, and you can save all the people on the train, the 10 people on the train by flipping the switch so the train goes off on a siding, but there's somebody on the siding that's going to get hit by the train and die. Most people will say flip the switch because at least only one person gets hit instead of everybody on the train dying. But if you make it more visceral, if you say you can keep the train from going off the cliff, but it's going to require shoving somebody under the wheels of the train, physically taking them, and people, it's like, I can't do it. I can't just do this thing so directly involved with pushing the person under the train. I'm going to let these 10 people die and not do it. So that this idea, it kind of gets weird when you start thinking about the whole way we've kind of made kind of warfare more depersonalized. If you've got a little drone and you just push a button and somebody dies versus you have to go and stick a knife through their heart and watch them bleed out in front of you. It's very different in terms of what it's emotional and even where you decide the balances in terms of what makes sense on a pragmatic level and what makes sense in terms of what can I do here. And people have implicated particularly the anterior cingulate gyrus in where is this kind of processing going on? Where are you kind of balancing pragmatic versus kind of emotional affect and decision making? There's a lot of evidence that we are not that rational a lot of the time. There's all sorts of experiments you can do showing how different things affect your decision making based upon emotions or what other people are, if you think someone's watching you or not. There's one of the funny sayings, but it has some truth, that a lot of times kind of our rationalization for why we did that was just kind of to justify what we're going to do anyway. It's like we know what we want to do or we're going to do, and then we come up with a reason why that made sense on a rational level. Of course, that's what I did. But it's often it's more complicated than that. All right, so now what we're going to do is we are going to leave the cerebrum, but we're going to stay in the things that derived from the forebrain. What else came from the forebrain besides the cerebral hemispheres?
The encephalon, thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus.
Exactly. So we're going to go there now. Well, so if you kind of crack the two sides of the brain open, there's the hemisphere. Then you're going to see this thing that's going to be the thalamus. And we need to kind of put the context of, here's the front. There's the thalamus. There's the region kind of up above here called the epithalamus. And then the region kind of below it here called the hypothalamus. So these are the three main components that make up the diencephalon. And so we're going to talk about each one in turn here. Let's start with the epithalamus. Epithalamus is the roof of the third ventricle. The epithalamus, its main claim to fame is this is the location of the pineal gland. Pineal gland, it means from pine cone. It looks like a little pine cone up in there. And pineal gland makes, in fact, let's just talk about it now since we'll have to talk about it eventually. Pineal gland, it makes melatonin. Which is a hormone. Hormone, again, a hormone is a signaling molecule, but that gets distributed through your bloodstream to your entire body. And melatonin is implicated with circadian rhythms. Basically day and night cycles. You know, we're not going to be getting that much into that in this class, but there is a lot of control about how your body responds to day and night. And melatonin goes up and down over the course of the day. More and more melatonin. If you take melatonin, you're going to get sleepier. You know, and it's not just your brain. All your cells all across your body actually have responses to these circadian rhythms and go into these different modes where they're more kind of active versus kind of more in this kind of shut down and repair kind of mode. So melatonin is implicated in controlling these circadian rhythms, day-night rhythms in your body. You know, in other animals, melatonin is also implicated in kind of mating behaviors. You know, most mammals only mate in very specific periods, right? If you're like, if you're a cat, you know, a female cat isn't just always ready to have sex. She goes into heat, and there is a time when she's receptive, and then all the male tomcats come and everybody, and there's a whole big ruckus outside. Most animals are very demonstrative when they are fertile. Humans are pretty rare in this kind of, you know, what the female is actually fertile or not is hidden. Like you can't just look at them and like if you're a baboon, it's like, oh, your butt's bright color. It's like, oh, you're fertile. Or you're a cat in heat and you're going, it's estrus. You're like, you know, advertising it to the world. In humans, you know, humans are some of the few animals that just mate kind of more like at random times rather than just in these very specific periods. And so in some of the other mammals, melatonin plays a role in controlling that whole cycle as well. They call like estrus, which is kind of very specific times versus the way we as humans do it. So melatonin. Epithalamus also has a choroid plexus in it. What does a choroid plexus do?
Produce CSF.
Exactly, produces CSF. So that's epithalamus. Pineal, there's kind of a fun history of pineal gland, just like Rene Descartes, when he's trying to figure out like, where is consciousness? Looked at the pineal gland, and anatomically, it's one of the only unpaired structures in the brain. It's kind of in the center of the brain. There's just one of them. It looks like it kind of everything comes into it there. So he thought the pineal gland must be the seat of the soul. But in reality, we now know that is not true. In fact, consciousness doesn't really seem to be anywhere in particular. I'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about more of the kind of integrative aspects of the brain as a whole. But whatever consciousness is, it's distributed. And there's no one place. He kind of thought like the pineal gland was kind of like the little control room where you kind of take everything in and exist. But it's pretty clear that that's not the way consciousness works. You can, we'll see it. We'll talk about that more later. So pineal gland, not the seat of the soul. Thalamus. The thalamus does a variety of things, but we'll kind of say one of its main functions is going to be sensory relay station. Relay meaning take the information in and then now send it off up into the cortex. So pretty much most of your senses come into here, synapse here, and then get sent up into the cortex for further processing. There seems to be some basic perception or sense of things going on once there's activity in the thalamus, but all of the more kind of advanced kind of understanding of what exactly is the sense and processing of the sense is happening later on in the cortex. But it goes through the thalamus first. The thalamus, in fact, we're going to talk about this again a little later, but the only sense that has some direct connections into the brain without going through the thalamus first is olfaction, your sense of smell. So the sense of smell is kind of the most primitive, the most directly wired into just the real like baseboards of your brain. But every other sense other than smell, olfaction, first synapses in the thalamus and then gets sent up into the higher brain regions. So thalamus. Next, the hypothalamus, which is, I love the hypothalamus. It's kind of does a lot of cool stuff. Whoopsie. So again, here's the brain. Here was the thalamus. Here was the epithalamus. Here's the thalamus. We have to make sure you get the face. So the hypothalamus is kind of coming off bottom, kind of anterior. Hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland, we're going to talk about, in another 2 months, is this master gland that controls lots of your other glands. The pituitary gland, I'm going to say it's kind of like a master gland. What does that mean? It controls your adrenal glands. It controls your stress response. It controls your gonads. And the hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland. We'll talk much more about that when we get to the endocrine system. There's 2 different ways. It does through kind of actually direct formation of hormones through the posterior pituitary, and through these releasing hormones through the hypophyseal portal system for the anterior pituitary. But either way, the hypothalamus is basically controlling the release of pituitary gland hormones, which then are controlling all sorts of other things, controlling your kidneys, controlling your stress response, controlling growth, and controlling so much stuff in your body. So, when we think about the endocrine system, the hypothalamus is the way that your nervous system actually is pulling the strings and has this very, very direct, intimate control over your endocrine system. So that's one thing the hypothalamus does. Other things that the hypothalamus does, there's a lot of autonomic control. Kind of blood pressure, respiration, things like that. Temperature. Your main thermostat is in your hypothalamus. When we talk about fever later, when we get to the immune system, it's basically molecules that go and talk to the hypothalamus and reset your basic thermostat. And it does, we're going to see when we get down into the brainstem, there are places that control blood pressure and respiration in a more direct way, but the hypothalamus is more kind of the big picture of kind of modulating all that activity. This is where you have a lot of drives. This is where you have hunger, thirst, sex drive. When we get to the kidneys, we're going to see, well, osmolarity, we're going to talk about fluid balance. If your osmolarity gets too high, you're going to have parts of your hypothalamus turning on that say, I'm thirsty, I need to drink more water. There are emotions that are in here. Rage, pleasure, etc. So there's a lot going on in the hypothalamus. It's don't use this as the only way to remember the hypothalamus, because it does lots. But one of the funny things that people say that I think it's funny enough that it's worth saying, they say like hypothalamus, the 4 F's, like fighting, fleeing, feeding, kind of fighting and fleeing, kind of like, oh, fear, I should add fear in here. Fighting, fleeing, feeding, and, reproduction. So, so the 4 F's. So, but lots of other things as well. Like I said, emotions, autonomic control, like blood pressure, respiration, temperature control, hunger, thirst. So it's doing lots of things. And if you think about it, there are some major connections between, your brain and your kind of physical body, your autonomic functioning, right? You get embarrassed and blood vessels dilate in your face and you blush. You get nervous and your stomach starts feeling all weird. You get scared and you pee in your pants or something, right? There's like a physical thing that happens based on something that, you might think is psychological. You can have just stress in your brain talks to the hypothalamus, which talks to the pituitary gland, which talks to your adrenal glands, which increases the amount of cortisol and depresses the amount of white blood cells in your body and suppresses your immune system. So you can actually measure like actual lowered white blood cell counts and decreased immune response, in response to these hormones, which are ultimately responding to things that are like just in your thoughts. So this idea, people talk about like psychosomatic or whatever, it's not that shocking to realize that things that are in your kind of mind actually manifest in physical ways in your body. There's this pretty intimate connection in here. I'll read you this quote that I think I got it here. That cracks me up. Yeah, I have this. I'll read it because it's just, again, I think it's funny. It's like this guy, Simon LeVay. He says, people tend to stay away from the hypothalamus. Most brain scientists prefer the sunny expanses of the cerebral cortex to the dark claustrophobic regions at the base of the brain. They think of the hypothalamus, though they would never admit this to you, as haunted by animal spirits and the ghosts of primal urges. They suspect that it houses not the usual shiny hardware of cognition, but some witch's brew of slimy, pulsating neurons adrift in a broth of mind-altering chemicals. So I don't know. I get a kick out of that. So hypothalamus doing a lot of autonomic control. It's going to be an important part of emotional processing, important for these drives like hunger, thirst, again, temperature control, things like that.